Well, here we are again.
Here we are.
Here we are. How many times have we done a double act together? This act together?
A lot.
A lot. We did that time at the 92nd Street Y. Do you remember?
I remember what I wore, but I don't remember it.
We both told tales of New York. We both told the worst thing that ever happened to us in New York. And I told about a story that's actually in this book about when the rats came to our loft. And you told about nearly being drowned in the townhouse.
Oh, yeah.
On the Upper East Side.
I hate to treat you like a jukebox, but that's one of my favorite stories, and I might ask you to tell it later. I know a lot of Adam's stories, but reading them, it was like, yes, you know the stew he makes, but like when guests come and it's in a book, suddenly it's beef bourguignon.
Patty knows most of these stories because we lived together, in effect. Patty lived directly upstairs from us for many happy years, and it was like the best old-fashioned sitcom that had ever been put together, because I would start cooking dinner for the family, for my wife Martha and the two children, at about 6 o'clock, and the door would open, and it would be that moment, oh, it's Patty Marx, right? And everybody applauds in the studio audience, right? And Patty is the funniest woman in New York, would come in and say, and you'd say, oh, we're really struggling now with Olivia's imaginary friend. And Patty would say, imaginary friend, I have a story about imaginary friend. You'd have a few great lines about that.
And they would say, do you want to have dinner with us? And I'd say, sure. And then I'd watch them eat because I don't really eat.
Patty lives on air, very good air, but lives on air.
It's been very sad since Paul and I moved away. And I don't know how I've managed, but I have managed to buy clothes, because before, everything I bought, I took home and then I brought it down to see if Martha approved.
Anyway, so she heard all my stories as I was telling them. But what I didn't realize until you and I started talking a while ago is that we arrived in New York. This is a book about arrival in New York in 1980, when Martha and I got off the bus from Canada. I was overly meticulous, and I said at one point this is the bus from Hyannis, because the truth is we went from Montreal to Hyannis to have a little kind of pre-honeymoon. We weren't married yet. On Cape Cod, and then we got back on the bus. So at one point, the flap copy said they left Hyannis for New York City, which made it sound like we were Cape Codders permanently. But we left
or
Canada.
Kennedys.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. We left the Kennedy compound. And then you say, well, how interesting is that? Anyway, we came from Canada to New York, to Manhattan, in the fall of 1980, and so I gather did you.
Yes, you said in the book August, and I took it as August because I also came to New York in August of that year. I, unlike you, Adam had sort of grunt jobs that got a little better and better and better until he reached the New Yorker. I came to New York and had the best job I've ever had in my life, and have been ever since, working my way down.
But that was writing for Saturday Night Live.
Right. And then it went down, 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 down. But why did you come to New York? And then you can ask me why I came to New York.
I will. We were both, and to add to our twinness, we were both born in Philadelphia.
Yes.
And I was raised in Philadelphia until I was 12.
And you got out.
And then got out. My parents fled Philadelphia in 1968 to go to Canada, and where I spent the rest of my childhood and adolescence, to Montreal. Why did we come to New York? We had been to New York in the summer of 1978, I guess. We came for the first time, August of 78. And I had not been in New York in a long time. When I was a kid living in Philadelphia, a little kid, my parents would come to New York on Saturdays to go looking at art. That was the days when all the art galleries were up on 57th Street and Madison Avenue, sort of hard to imagine now, but they were. And they would come and look at art, and they put together actually kind of a very nice, choice little collection of pop and minimalism in the days when college professors could do such things. Now you would have to own a university to even consider doing it, but they did that. So this is a long-winded way of saying that I loved the vibe, the feeling of New York. We saw, my father said, "There's Buddy Hackett," or something, some equally significant cultural figure would be around.
Right.
And so we came back in the summer of 78, and it was overwhelming because this was, all of you are too young to remember this, I say, looking out at this audience. But in the 1970s, New York, this was taxi driver New York. This was supposedly hellish New York. And that was, if you've seen Taxi Driver recently, it's really an astoundingly beautiful film, but it's about a descent into the inferno, a descent into hell. And that's how New York was pictured, not least of all by my parents, and even more by Martha's Canadian parents. But we came in 78, and it wasn't like that at all. It was, there were jazz clubs, and there were museums, and we just were enchanted, Bloomingdale's. And we just fell in love with it and said, okay, we're going to go to college for as short a time as we have to, and then we'll come to New York City. And we were just determined to do it. And everyone in our family regarded it as a lunatic idea, not just quixotic.
To come to America or New York?
To come to America a little, but to come to New York a lot.
Because you'd get shot.
You wouldn't survive the first month, especially a couple of wet behind the ears Canadian youngsters like us. And it is true that on Martha's first day working in New York, she was becoming a film editor. Her first day working in New York at the Film Center on 9th Avenue and 45th Street, a dead body was discovered in the dumpster on the ground floor. And we sort of took it for granted that was just part of New York. You had dead bodies in dumpsters.
We were saying in the green room, everything that we found in New York, we just thought, well, that's living in New York. How exciting.
And we are the little tiny room that we lived in. We rented. So we came back and we rented. I'm telling the story totally out of chronology, but we said that's what we're going to do. We finished university in Canada, which is 3 years, not 4. So we were still kind of kids. I got a fellowship, a traveling fellowship for $3,500. And I thought, well, now we got it made, right? It's going to be every night at the Cafe Carlyle with the help of the Canadian government. So, and we came down and we rented, in an act of folly whose origins I still cannot entirely trace or understand, we rented the smallest apartment in New York. It was that you
could find.
Yes, we really did. It was
not small enough. Yes, I'd like to see another.
Well, that's more or less what happened. And I remember the realtor, who was sort of, not like the world's most active realtor, helping us find our $300 a month apartment, but nonetheless was shocked. He was showing us this place to show us what the bottom line was. So, we love this. And it was a 9 by 11 room. And I do a kind of one-man show that goes along with the book. It's a storytelling show from all these moth stories that I've told. And the way I always begin it is I ask someone from the audience to come up, and we draw mysteriously a 9 by 11 rectangle. And then I walk back off and come back out and begin the show and say, you've been asking yourselves, what is this 9 by 11 rectangle that we just drew in or described in Masking Tape? That is the size of the entire universe that Martha and I shared for 3 years when we came to New York. And this is true, and no one ever credits it.
When I came to New York, before I came to New York, I'd visit friends that were living in New York, and I would feel so sorry for them living in these apartments. And I came to New York, and none of those apartments that I felt so bad about I could afford. I mean, and I remember, and I didn't. I wish someone had told me how bad it was, because I remember being shown an apartment on 1 Christopher Street for no money and thinking, that's a little below my standard.
Well, one of the things that was funny is when we were coming to look for our first apartment, we expected that we would get, a 5-story walk-up. Because in every movie about New York, every comedy about New York from the 60s, a genre that I really love, Barefoot in the Park and Sunday in New York and Barefoot on Sunday and all of those wonderful rom-coms of or Come Blow Your Horn of the early 60s, the aspiring young people climb 5 flights to the young couple, to Robert Redford and Jane Fonda, to their first apartment, which is small, but all the way up. And all of the apartments we were shown, and when I say we were shown, somebody handed us the keys and you went over and the super let you in, were in the basement. They were called garden apartments, right? Remember that? The garden consisted of the dirt in which the cockroaches lived, right? An entomological garden. And it took me a long time to realize that the reason is that no one ever leaves an apartment in New York. So all of those people from the early 1960s who had gotten the 5-story walk-ups were still there. They hadn't moved at all. And I made a joke out of that. I said, New York real estate is a game of musical chairs with music and no chairs, right? Nobody ever goes around. So I was reading Neil Simon's memoir, which is a very good book called something like Stages, or I can't know what it's called. All theatrical memoirs have the same titles. Have you noticed?
Yeah, it's
you know,
always
it's
a
like
pun on-
it's always a pun on,
Yeah.
you know, curtains up,
Enter,
right? Yes, enter laughing,
Yeah.
curtains up, right? Final countdown, playbill, you know, always. In his memoir, he talks about writing barefoot in the park, which kind of the one word I hate more than any, iconic, but it's sort of the iconic.
That's a bad one.
I mean, it's a bad word, right? But it is that comedy. And it turns out that 5-story walk-up, I don't know how many people have seen the apartment, that Jane Fonda and Robert Redford begin life in, Neil Simon and his wife were still living in that apartment with a child.
Yeah.
They was in a
that's
drawer.
I mean, only in New York do they.
Right, when he wrote Barefoot in the Park.
Wow.
They were still living in that
Wow.
apartment. And only after the success of Barefoot in the Park did they get a bigger
Well,
apartment.
people die.
Yes.
When I lived with Adam and in the same building as Adam and Martha, there was a stretch of a short amount of time where a lot of people in our building were dying. And do you know the story where I'm going? And
No, I
Steve,
actually don't.
You know Steve. He
Right.
doesn't have a last name, but you know who I mean.
Yes.
He said to the doorman.
Steve in the elevator, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Steve in the elevator. He said to the doorman, "It's a shame, because it was Garrett and then it was George and all these
Right.
people were dying." And the doorman said to him, "You're on the 5th floor. Don't worry. They're taking them from the top."
I didn't know that story.
And
But
it was in a way because the
it was
older
true.
people
The older
had
people had gotten the better apartments,
yeah.
and they were on the top. It
And they
serves them
didn't
right, you know. I mean,
Right.
so the thing is that it turned out you had to be the single most successful, commercially successful playwright in the history of the American theater to move from your apartment. And I thought that's a deep New York
Yeah.
truth, right?
Right.
And so we rented this tiny apartment in the basement. And nowadays, people, our kids and the next generation are all going to Brooklyn, right? That's the single greatest reversal in New York life in my lifetime, is that the great suction pump of talent, which used to send Moss Hart or Alfred Kazin from Brownsville to Manhattan, now sends an entire generation from Manhattan to Brownsville.
Except now they can't afford it.
They can't afford. No, exactly.
They have to come to poor Manhattan.
I keep making that mistake because I keep saying something. I say suavely, and now everybody has to go out to Crown Heights in Williamsburg.
Yeah.
You can't afford Crown Heights in
Right,
Williamsburg.
right.
Now they all go to Astoria and Bed-Stuy. Nope. That's
Yeah,
like going to
right.
Park Avenue. You got
Canada.
yeah, exactly. Or Nassau
Philadelphia.
County, right? So in any case, we ended up. So what those old apartments were of our generation, your generation, my generation, they put you in a drawer and then they shut the drawer. And if you were still alive 3 years later, they let you stay in New York.
Because you didn't know any better and you loved
didn't know,
it.
and you loved it, and you took for granted the things that were really dangerous and aberrant were just kind of the way New York was. So we had, I realize now, and I write about it in the book, an infestation of cockroaches. I mean, that apartment.
You have so many vermin in your book
Yes.
that I would say they're the major characters.
I'd say they're
more than the Bible has plagues.
Yeah, this is true. And I think if you ever adapted this as a musical comedy, you would have a chorus of cockroaches
Yeah,
in the first act, and then a mice in Act 2 rising.
The
to
singing rats.
Yes, to the singing rats. We started with an insane plague of cockroaches in the apartment we called the Blue Room after the Rodgers and Hart song. We'll share a blue room, a new room for 2 room, which we really believed in. We bought a copy of the sheet music on the day we were married at City Hall downtown. And then, and we used to, Martha and I are both Canadians. I mean, Martha is a true Canadian. The people do not get more Canadian than Martha because she comes from an Icelandic Winnipeg background. If any of you have ever seen any of Guy Glover's movies, you'll know it's as Canadian as you can get. There's a wonderful movie about Martha's relatives, basically, called Careful. Because that's all Icelandic Canadians ever say. Oh, careful. Oh, you better be careful when you do this. Oh, be careful. And that's what their whole thing is. So they're incredibly polite and cautious people. And so we thought that you could sort of discourage cockroaches the way Canadians discourage people from invading the country, which is sort of say, please don't do that.
Yeah, right.
So we put this is true. We put a piece of plywood about 4x2 up against the baseboard. We thought, that'll keep them out, indicate that there are people living here now. You're not wanted. And and there were every imaginable kind of cockroach in that place. There were little Asian cockroaches, and there were, above all, there were these giant water bugs.
It was the cockroach UM.
Yes, it was exactly. And as our friend Paul Rusin was saying before, one of the weird things about cockroaches is it takes 2 whacks to kill them, inevitably, right? You hit them once.
In New York.
In New York,
other
right?
places, one.
You hit them twice. And water bugs had this capacity, if you remember them. They sort of were like fragment bombs. You hit them, that second time they blew up, right? Right across. But they had very powerful thighs. And so the whole thing would explode in a bag of brown water, and then you'd have this very powerful little articulated thigh left on the floor. You can imagine for Martha how appetizing this was. And this is in a tiny space.
Well,
and that was and so then we had cockroaches. Then we moved. We were very lucky to get to move downtown, but to a loft. But our loft building was infested with rodents. And so first we had an infestation of mice. And they, the heartbreaking thing is, I realize now, is, you sort of say, oh, there's one mouse there. I guess we have a mouse living in that. But you don't have a mouse. Right. You get mice. And we had and one of the kind of, I hope, sort of emotional climaxes of the book occurs when we came home one night after we had had a wonderful dinner out, which was financed by a check that I had gotten 9 o'clock that morning for a keynote speech that I had delivered at 8 a.m. that I had only found out I was supposed to deliver at 11 p.m. the night before.
That's like a happy ending to an anxiety dream, which never happens.
This is true. At 11 p.m., someone called and said, we're all looking forward to your keynote tomorrow morning at the Pluralism and Individualism Conference. And I couldn't remember. That's totally in character for me to totally forget what I was supposed to do. But we got the check, and we came back from dinner, and I opened the door, and it was like one of those terrible old 30s cartoons that they used to show when we were kids, right? Where the little mice are playing bass violins and fiddles. It was horrible. And we walked.
And said to you, what are you doing here?
Yes. We walked uptown, and that was next one. And then after we had finally gotten rid of the mice, we were home one night around Easter, as I recall. And why do I even know that it was Easter? And we heard incredibly powerful, heavy sound on the stamped-in ceiling above us. That's some big animal. And the whole building was filled with rats at that point. And there's nothing funny about rats. You cannot find a laugh about rats easily. But we got this fantastically highly motivated exterminator in, because as you can imagine, the owners had zero interest in doing anything about it. His name was Gilbert, and he came from the West Indies. And Gilbert was determined to do it, and he went looking for the rats, and he came back nodding. He said, yeah, you got them all right. He said, you got the big boys. I said, he said, you got the super rats. And I said, well, what do you mean the super rats, Gilbert? And he paused for me. He said, well, let me put it this way. He said, these rats, if you see one, they look at you like you the problem. And they did. They looked at you like you the problem. And we struggled. And finally, and it's sort of, in a certain sense, it's the serious climax of the book in a certain way. Yeah, Gilbert kept saying, you got to come down and see the basement. You have to come down and see the basement. You got to come down and see. You're never going to understand about the big boys if you don't come down. I didn't want to go down to the basement. Finally, I did. And what he showed me in this building that we lived in on Broome Street, this old, cast iron building, that there were no boundaries in the basement. You could hear the subway going on Broadway a block away. There was essentially, the whole building was open to the world. The basement was open to the world. And he was sort of saying, you may think you're secure in your loft up above and all of that too, but the reality of New York is down here in this basement. This is chaos and Hades and hell down here. And I said, is there nothing you can do? And he said, no. He said, there's nothing you can do. They would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Your landlord's not going to pay the money to close this off. He said, all we can do is practice the 3 cons. We can contain and convert. And what we can do is we can get the rats to go to the next building, basically. That's what he was saying. We cannot eliminate them. We can move them along someplace else. And I always thought that in a weird way that there was something profound about that particular lesson, right? About the degree to which we live on in a kind of, I don't know how to put this well, on a kind of corrupted island in a certain way. And that the corruption of it, there's a term I like very much in art conservation. Art conservatives refer to inherent vice. I discovered when I was doing a piece once about Albert Pinkham Ryder. And they mean by that things in the painting surface that you can't fix. They're inherent to the crackle and the and breaking. I put that in a piece, and Fran Lebowitz said to me once, "Oh, I'm going to use that as a title for this novel I'm writing." And apparently she's been working for like 25 years in a novel called Inherent Vice.
But isn't it a novel by Pynchon or something?
Oh, did Pynchon use it, actually?
And then it became a movie.
But he didn't write to me about it, right?
No, he
didn't. So, but in any case.
He was busy writing the book, whereas
I
Fran
guess so.
was busy
could have dropped me a
thinking
line.
about the title.
Could have dropped me a line. In any case, the obviously not original with me, that expression. That was sort of, for me, the kind of philosophical climax of the book, right? It's the moment when you say, you come to terms with the reality that New York, no matter how much we love it, no matter how much, and this is a book about going from becoming, starting as strangers and becoming citizens, you will never be reconciled to New York, and New York will certainly never be reconciled to you. But once you have that knowledge someplace deep in your bloodstream, you can manage. That was how I chose to experience with philosophical
I've
detachment.
had a lot of some vermin encounters, and I have to say, when you tell a story about rats in New York or any kind of animal, it is a metaphor. I was standing in the subway, and a couple came over who were clearly tourists and said, "Are you from New York?" I said, "Yes." And they said, "We've been wondering, why is it," because they were looking, as we all do, at the rats scurrying around the subway tracks. They go, "Why don't they just go and live in Central Park?"
because the raccoons would destroy them. Right? There's nothing to eat in Central Park, and the Central Park is filled with creatures of its own.
How much after that episode did you leave New York? Was that close to?
Not far from that, because I viewed this Gilbert's epiphany with philosophical fascination. Martha viewed it as, let's leave. I want to go.
Right.
So that was in 92, I guess, which is really where the book ends, is in 92. And then we left we had a child, Luke, and then we left to go to Paris not long after that.
You should, maybe before, the book is called At the Stranger's Gate, and it is, another book of yours is Through the Children's Gate. An unknowing person looking at those titles might think that you've been involved in a lot of scandals.
I worried about that. So the titles come from Central Park, because when Olmsted and Vox, as I'm told to call them, were designing Central Park, they decided in a fit, it's not clear if they did it or someone else around, but someone in a fit of poetic imagination said, let's call all the entrances to the park gates and give each one a distinctive character. So there is, if you may have noticed, the Scholars Gate, the Miners Gate, the Engineers Gate, the Students Gate, the Children's Gate at 75th and Fifth Avenue, and the Strangers Gate, which is up on the far Upper West Side around 108th Street in Central Park West. And when I discovered this, when we first moved to New York, we discovered this, in that moment, you have about a month when you come to New York, when you're just determined to see everything. We're going to ride the Staten Island Ferry, right? Let's go down to Chinatown. We've yet to explore Inwood, right?
And after that month,
yes,
you do
nothing. Nothing.
Like, I never saw the Statue of Liberty in that month, so I will never
see the Statue. No, you have 1 month to make a tour, and then it's your subway and your block, and fuck it. It's really...
Well, it's kind of like you always see what's on exhibit at the museum, but the permanent exhibit, I'll see that when I retire.
Exactly. No, it's... You never. So in that first month, I became aware of these things, and I thought at that time, what a beautiful idea. And and we came in through the Stranger's Gate, metaphorically, because we came in as strangers, and this is a book about how strangers become citizens in New York, as did the rats come in as strangers and become citizens. And so that was the inspiration for it. And Central Park has always played a very large role in my own imagination of the city as well. I wrote a long piece about Olmsted once, and I've always thought that Olmsted. But people misunderstand Olmsted because they think of him as a kind of sylvan park designer. I'm getting far afield here. This isn't in the book. But the truth is that Olmsted was a journalist, a writer for the New York Times, long before he was a park designer. And his design of Central Park is a response to the things that he experienced as a writer and as an observer. As a journalist, particularly down in the South, when he viewed the horrors of slave society and said, one of the reasons that this place is no real culture is because they have no intermediate institutions. They don't have what he called, beautiful phrase, commonplace civilization, which means just all the kind of ordinary ways in which people bump into each other, collide with each other, come together in improvised and organized ways. They play softball. They play bocce. They play chess. They go on the carousel. And that kind of complicated inner life of Central Park, I've always thought was an incredibly moving model of what we want from cities generally. That's not in the book, but it's a little add
A little bonus.
A little bonus.
What do you miss about the 80s? Anything? Or yeah.
You know, I suppose I miss the Old Soho. We were incredibly lucky to blunder in for reasons that are eventually explained in the course of the book that have to do with another reign of rats and a lunatic who had been in our apartment before that left the landlady, a sweet woman, saying, I will do anything to have a semi-normal couple in this place, right? So we walked in the next day and she said, you've got it, and just sit there and be normal. And I miss, you know, so we had the great good fortune by pure chance to kind of come of age in Soho. And Soho in those years, in the 1980s, was a coherent little, as I call it, a village of art. It was sort of a little cathedral village of art. Now, I should add immediately that anyone who had moved to Soho in the 60s or the 70s regarded it as already ruined and had been turned into a mall and was long gone by 1980. But for our experience, it was still a coherent place. It was really a village. It was bordered on Houston Street in the north, Canal Street in the south, Broadway on the east, and 6th Avenue on the west, and every important gallery in the city was there. And it was a time when New York was still seen as the capital of art. And so to be there and see that and be aware of it as a coherent little community, you know, you would see Richard Serra striding along the street scowling at midnight, and Donald Judd going in and out of his beautiful house on Prince Street. You would see, there was a period of time, and I can no longer recall their names, I can't find them online. There was a couple, a Japanese artist and two conceptual artists whose piece was to be chained together for an entire year. Do you remember this?
I do.
And then, were you one of them?
Were you one of them?
I could have been. Martha and I
Wait.
sort of lived. Could have been. And maybe it's a. In any case, there was this incredibly rich and
There was
voluptuous.
a movie about them.
Oh, was there really?
Does anybody
There's
know?
movies about everything apparently that I never see.
But when you said, it's a phrase I haven't heard for a long time, and I couldn't find it online. That's like,
it's
when that
unimaginable.
happens to me, I think, I'm just not looking hard enough. Everything has to be
Well, you know, one of the
online.
coolest things that happened in the course of doing this book is that I write it. There's a whole chapter about one of my first jobs was giving gallery lectures at MoMA. You know, I stood in front of pictures and talked about them. I was a graduate student in art history, and I, you get $50, kind of form of art prostitution. You know, they'd slip you $50 on the bureau when as you left. And you did this, and I love doing it because I just got to talk when I realized that's the one thing I did with any kind of oomph at all. Anyway, one of the chapters really about all of the interesting and odd people who would come and hear these lectures. Because in those days, there was still sort of what I call a folk culture of modernism in New York. I mean by that, there were a lot of people who came to the Museum of Modern Art because they were deeply attached to the pictures in a way that now that it costs, whatever it costs, $40, and, you know, people don't feel the same kind of organic sense of attachment to the institutions. So there was, you know, one guy who did needlepoint versions of every Picasso in the museum, including the Guernica, which you get an ochre and lime. And he would come in and show you these things. There was a guy named Maxie Shacknow who loved Van Gogh and was painting a portrait of Theo Van Gogh, which is the one picture Vincent never painted. He never painted a portrait of his brother, who was his main support, but Maxie was going to paint it for him. He said Van Gogh was a great artist and a horrible brother. And so I was remembering this, and I had eventually done a little talk story about Maxie for the New Yorker, and went online. I wonder, you know, is there any trace? And sure enough, he had opened a museum in Fort Lauderdale, the Maxie Shacknow Museum of Fine Arts. It closed after, 18 months, but he had actually opened it and put his portrait of Theo Van Gogh in that museum. And I was sort of like stunned because he was always talking about, someday I'll have a museum of my own. He was a guy working in the garment industry, and God damn it, he had done it. He had actually done it. And then the double punchline of this story is that just about 5 years ago, an art historian in Stockholm, or in the Netherlands, I think it was a Swedish art historian working in the Netherlands, a needless detail, forgive me, discovered that there was a portrait of Theo Van Gogh. That in fact, one of the what we thought of as a self-portrait of Vincent was actually a portrait of his brother. And how they figured it out was complicated, but there's no question that it's
Did you
right.
email Maxie to tell him?
Maxie, unfortunately, is long gone. He had died before this thing had happened. Thank God, because he thought he was the only one who had painted a portrait. And what was so interesting about it and kind of revealing was that Vincent had totally subsumed, sort of cannibalized his own brother in his own image. You knew that you could tell that it was his brother for various reasons. And it was sort of a reminder of how much egotism there is in Van Gogh. You know, Van Gogh's a great genius, and we tend to be very pious about him. But he wasn't a good brother. You know, Maxie was right. And that was a useful reminder. Anyway, that was, we were talking about Google and the things you can find. So one more thing I miss about the 80s in New York, it isn't specific to New York in the 80s, where I do miss Soho and that whole coherent culture of art, is it was really the last time, in retrospect, when you could, before the digital age dawned, it really was. And, you know, so, and you experienced the same thing, Patty, but I got a job after I lost the one at MoMA. I got a real job, sort of, at GQ magazine as the grooming editor, where I started as the copy editor, but I was promoted because I did such a brilliant job of finding little tags for the clothes. I invented the phrase Chiaroscuro Chic. On that basis, I got promoted to grooming editor. But in those days, those were good jobs to have.
Don't be humble. Tell them where it was appeared.
Oh, they blew it up at Barney's, and they put it up there. And Martha and I wandered into Barney's one day. We were still living in the 9x11 room. We saw this giant like Chiaroscuro Chic, and I've never felt as good about being a writer before or since. It was the only time I've ever been happy as a writer. And that's sort of serious because, you know, the truth is being a writer, the part that's gratifying about being a writer, apart from, you know, not having to get dressed in the morning and all the kind of the little extras that you get, is that you take these little soft bullets of matter, of words, and you fire them into people's heads, into their consciousness. And they enter them, and they, you know, and you're sort of stunned and that was the first time that ever happened to me, right? When two little ridiculous alliterative words that I picked out suddenly became soft bullets fired into another's head.
What, obviously you know, but this book is really marvelous. And not only are the stories hilarious, but you so deftly, it's like you're sitting next to, your dinner companion has the funniest, best stories, and he's also the smartest professor of culture 101 and writing, and you discuss so beautifully writing and art and ambition and marriage and throw in a few famous people. It's not that we're going to still talk. I just wanted to say it is a great book, and not only because it's hilarious and the stories are so funny.
Well, that is so sweet of you to say, Patty, and means an enormous amount to me coming from you, and I didn't know you were going to say that.
No, but I just wanted to.
But that's because you finished the book moments before we sat down here.
I did, and I remember
God.
so much.
What if it were awful? You know,
it's like I read it 5 minutes ago.
It feels that way. It's so vivid that it's almost like you finished it a minute ago.
You know. Full disclosure, I thought we were doing
it on
tomorrow,
Thursday. Yes,
so I thought I had scads.
That was
time.
the same organizational genius that got me, made me forget about doing the keynote.
I didn't even have the book until 5 minutes ago, and
right. And
before I did, I really shouldn't say this in a bookstore, but I thought, well, I could bullshit my way through if I just look at Amazon's Look Inside feature, and. Really, Strand put your hands over your ears, but you could learn a lot from the Look Inside
Look
feature.
Inside is a great feature. Look Inside is a great feature. You could give yourself a whole education.
Yeah.
In fact, my life would have been much less tiring and expensive if I just told that to our children, to Luke and Olivia. You know what? Just use the Look Inside feature. Forget school. Just you'll learn as much, right?
Well,
just press on those things. But what I was going to say. After being touched and pleased that you say that, is that the one thing that was conscious in doing this book and putting this book together was I started off realizing I had all these little stories that I'd been telling largely for the Moth, the wonderful storytelling group, about that period in our life in New York. And people laughed at them. I thought, this could come together. And then when I put them together as transcriptions, my friend Moeko Fuji, who's with us tonight, did that work and brought them all together. They looked incredibly thin because the space between a spoken story and a written chapter is quite remarkably large. And then I realized, well, I got to aerate this book with other stuff. And I realized that what I could aerate it with was these little kind of mini anthropologies. So that I tell the story. The opening chapter is all about how I lost my pants on our first week in New York. We had bought one nice suit for me, and the tailor who did the hem the pants put it on in a suit bag that had no bottom. And the pants slipped off someplace between the tailor shop and our tiny apartment. And I never recovered those trousers. And it still hurts me when I tell that story. But the story was sort of complete, but when you just write it down, it reads, it's kind of a little blah. So I said, but, I could talk about what Bloomingdale's was like then, what it felt like to be there. So I started writing this little mini anthropology of Bloomingdale's, and then I realized, we love to eat Haagen-Dazs ice cream. Now, nowadays, Haagen-Dazs ice cream is the most fatuous thing you can eat. But at that time, it was very exciting because it was fake Scandinavian ice cream that had a much higher, and I don't know if any of you remember, they actually had a map of Scandinavia with a star pointing to the place where it wasn't actually made, right? So I thought, that's stuff that people don't remember now, right? So I began writing these little mini anthropologies to go along with the stories. And so the quality that you very sweetly like about it was the one kind of conscious piece of architecture in the book.
And you absolutely need it because a reader wants to think they're reading something very specific, but also very general that applies to themselves.
Yeah, it's one of the things that's true about the writing we both do, Patty, is that it is sort of, there's a certain little part of you that says, why does anyone want to read this?
Yeah, that who asked you voice.
Yes, exactly. Really, who cares? And the truth is that the kind of writing we do, which is based on the minutiae of life, or not everything we do, but a lot of what we do.
All of what I do.
And the best stuff that I do is all about I write, big, dense, thick essays that, so far as I can tell, no one actually reads, but they make for a very nice cover line at the New Yorker, right? 6 books on the internet, right? There's a basic alchemy that goes on, right? That the I of your experience has to become the you of other people's experience. And how that alchemy happens is mysterious, and it doesn't always happen. And we both know that. You'll write something that you feel, this is a good story, and this is nicely told, and you'll just see, people will look like, whitefish in the window of Zabar's as you tell the story, or you read it out loud.
It becomes your summer vacation slide.
Yeah, exactly. And you can hear the fan of the slide projector whirring in the background. Absolutely no one is interested. And you worry about that all the time. And one of the way you get around it is you make an appeal to general knowledge. To universality. Yeah. But basically it either kind of enters people's consciousness or it doesn't. And that was sort of the trick with this book, was to find that tone that would. But you basically pray, it's like...
You never know, do you? You never know.
You never know at all. You never know at all. In fact, when I was doing the Moth stories, which is sort of like stand-up for intellectuals, because you're really telling stories with a mic and without notes or any preparation. Like preparation, but not, not a script. A lot of preparation. Why did I say no preparation? Because I wasn't prepared. And you realize that, so I told the story that I just told in précis form about telling the pluralism and individualism keynote. And I always thought it was a funny story when I told it to you or to other folks. They laughed at it, and I got zero reaction. And I realized it was because the story I was telling was not part of universal experience. Losing your pants, that has happened to everyone. Everyone has broken something that they dearly loved, or lost something that they had just been given the day after they were given it. But all of us have had that experience where material loss, however trivial, comes at a time when we experience it as spiritual loss, right? That's a universal experience. But not being prepared to give a keynote address is a very peculiar experience to have. And you have to be one of, like big mouth people to have had it. And so
and not only that, you have to have somebody who doesn't put it in his calendar.
Yes, exactly. You have to be an extremely chaotic big mouth to have had that experience, which I am. And so you have to be a chaotic ham to have that experience. And the number of chaotic hams in the world is fortunately rather limited. There are some, but not an infinite number. And so when I retold the story in the version I tell in the book, it wasn't really about failing to prepare adequately for the lecture. It was, or the keynote, it was about Martha sleeping all the time. Because one of the interesting things about our marriage is that Martha, I am an insomniac. I've not slept in 25 years that I can remember. But Martha can sleep.
And so am I, and we have about 7/8 of a play.
Yes, we wrote in the middle of the night. Yes, well, are you awake? I'm awake. Let's write something. It was like long day driving. Yeah. We have to finish that play sometime. But Martha has that gift, which I deeply envy, of being able to sleep anywhere at any time through anything. And she can sleep for 10 hours at a stretch or 11 hours at a stretch. And so I changed, it was the truthful story. I changed the accent of the story so that it was about the phone rang right after Martha had fallen asleep, and the guy saying, "Can you come and are you coming to do your keynote tomorrow?" And then I went and did the keynote, and I got the check and all that, and Martha was still asleep when I got back into bed. That was all true, but I realized that was semi-universal. That is the way that every couple have radically different sleeping habits. Not usually as intensely radically different as ours are, but that had a little bit of alchemy that you could hope for. I see someone is in the back here suggesting.
Should we? I have
some questions?
I have about 100
Yeah,
more
if anybody wants to raise your hand,
you
I can bring you the mic and we can broaden it to the audience. I know it's a big undertaking to go first, but sweet.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I'm curious about the process of recollecting these stories. Did you keep a journal, or was it all from memory? And how did you decide what stories went into it?
Some of them were from things I'd written in the 1980s. In other words, there were several things that I'd actually written 30-some years ago that I either had published in the New Yorker, some of them anonymously when I was writing Talk of the Town back in the day when that was where we did it. And some of them I just written and never published anywhere. I was sat avidly, as I always say. I've been writing for the New Yorker now for 45 years, but they've only been aware of it for 30, right? And so some of it was that. A lot of it is just recollection. If you turn your memory on to a certain time, stuff starts coming back at you, names and places and things. And then a lot of it had been sort of kept alive by what I think historians call oral tradition. In other words, I've been telling these same damn stories so many times that finally our friends Luca and Emily said, "Why don't you make this into a book?" And at first I thought, what a nice idea. And then I realized they meant, please stop telling the same 5 stories over and over again. Retire those stories, please. So this is an act of sending my stories to Florida to retire and die. And I don't know if I have another group of them.
Anyone else have a question?
Someone else. Lady here.
I'm curious, speaking of universal experiences, at least for New Yorkers, if you can tell us about a time that you found yourself thinking of yourself as, an early time that you found yourself thinking of yourself as a New Yorker, and whether there's any, whether you find any found any personal value in having that kind of epiphany of, I've become a New Yorker.
You've been well primed to ask that question, because there's a very specific moment in the book, which actually I've been talking about. It's that end of that story about when the mice flooded our apartment, and we left. We couldn't stay in the apartment because there were hundreds of mice. There were probably 20 mice, but it felt like 100. 20 mice is 100, right? You round off your mice to the nearest 100, right? Once they get in more than in 2 digits. And I realized, as we were in this miserable state, expelled from our home, having to go up and stay with a friend, I suddenly realized that we were the mice of New York, right? Our relationship to New York was exactly like the relationship of the mice to our loft. No one had invited us. No one really wanted us. But we were making a living the way the mice were making a living. And so when I suddenly realized, the mice are not the strangers, we are the mice, I felt more at peace as a New Yorker, more of a citizen of New York than I'd ever been. And the other moment in the book that's like that, when did I feel a New Yorker? We were living on $3,500 a year, which was renewable 3 years. And I know if I didn't find some way of making more money by the end of the 3 years, we were going to have to go back to Canada. And Martha's mother was up in Canada praying at a Lutheran church twice a day that this would happen, that we would come back and she would get her daughter back and the crazy little Jewish guy would go away finally. I got a job finally. I got this job, the GQ, they promoted me from the freelance fashion copy editor to the part-time grooming editor, and finally they made me the fashion copy and grooming editor, and they gave me a job for $17,000 a year. And that seemed like all the money in the world to us at that time. And we realized when I went back, we were still living on this carpet, and I went back and I said to Martha, we're going, we both knew I got a job, we can stay. And in those days, and it's very different, I think, generationally, and I think you felt this too, right? There were jobs in New York for people who were aspiring, and it's one of the real enormous losses. It's very funny, I love Lena Dunham's Girls. I think it's a wonderful series. I know Lena gets a lot of stick for this and that, but she gets it in part because she has great audacity. And one of the rules of art, I really do think, is that inevitably the critics pile on for the very thing that's most original about you, right? And anyone can write, not anyone can, she's incredibly gifted. You can write warm and funny and interesting and cute stuff. But to, say, here's me naked in a bathroom, that took real audacity because that's the reality of human life, right? Is you spend an enormous amount of it naked in a bathroom. And I hugely admire Lena Dunham's work. But what I was going to say is that she gets, Hannah, the character in the course of Girls, gets exactly the same job I got at GQ at exactly the same moment in her life as a New York writer. Only I saw it as, oh my God, can you imagine we're going to stay? I'm on the ladder of success. I'm rewriting fashion copy, right? And she sees it as doom. She is trapped once she gets that job. She will never escape it. And I think that's a real generational difference. And I think it's a very profound generational difference and a very sad one. And it's partly a reflection of the internet age too, because when we were getting jobs of that kind, we feel like Reiner and Brooks now. Then I was a young boy in the year 2000. We thought it was as though there was no internet. So in order to have any kind of weight at all, you had to have access to the Soho News or the Village Voice or GQ or something. And as I say to my kids, it was as though there were 500 computers that could go online in all of New York City. And if somebody let you hands on that keyboard, you were really privileged, right? You were really had something special. So that was another moment when we went to dinner at a German restaurant on 86th Street. This is back in the days when Yorkville still existed on 86th Street. We had a wonderful dinner. I can still remember every mouthful of it because we never went out to eat in those days. And the snow was coming down, and we looked at each other and said, we're going to be able to stay. And Martha's mother's heart was broken, and we stayed.
You know what? Then there was mobility, and you knew there was certainty about the world, and you knew what the rules were and what the jobs were going to be in 5 years. I was teaching somewhere, and I don't know, the dean or somebody addressed the students and said to the incoming freshmen, don't worry about what you major in, because by the time you graduate, when you will end up in careers that don't exist now. So you can't say, I'm going to work hard and then I'm going to become a writer, I'm going to be a staff writer or an editor.
Yes, it's a transformed landscape, and it makes me hugely sad. I see it because my kids are living in that landscape now. And my son, Luke is a very good guitar player, but all of his teachers at college, his guitar teachers said, don't count on this. 20 years ago, you could have been a session musician to start, right?
Yeah,
whether you became, John McLaughlin or not, you could have been a session musician. There's no work like that left. It's all digitized. Don't be a guitar player. There are too many good guitar players out there who cannot make one penny. I say this glibly now, but I don't feel glibly about it. I think it's a huge loss, and it's a crisis in lots of ways. Generational change. Someone else.
Anybody else have a question? Maybe on that side of the room, so I can do my little run across again.
If we've been that boring that no question.
I have a lot of questions.
But you ask a question. Here's someone.
You said your best, your only moment of being happy as a writer was the Chiaroscuro Chic.
Yes.
Is that because I'm trying to do a little bit of writing myself, and it's interesting is that, I guess I'm hoping for that moment of satisfaction, but it's eluding you as well.
Patty can weigh in on this as well as I can. But no, that moment of satisfaction will never come. Being a writer.
And you know what? Do you think you've gotten, well, you have, I know the answer, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Well, frame it differently. In what ways have you become a better writer as the years have gone by?
Well, that's a very good question. To answer this question, being a writer is like, somebody once said, it's like having homework for the rest of your life, but it's much worse than that. It's like being like being cast, in Deliverance. You're really living through the plot of Deliverance for the rest of your life, right? You're struggling to make your way through these white waters, and there are vicious hillbillies lining it in every which way. They call themselves critics, reviewers, and it's miserable. It's still the one thing in the world that I like doing. And the satisfactions are genuinely, I was not exaggerating. I say it's the satisfaction is when you feel those soft bullets entering people's consciousness. And you realize you write something that is a reflection and organization of your own experience. Not because it's yours, but because it's experience. And other people wrap their own lives around it for 5 minutes. And that feeling when I see somebody on the subway reading The New Yorker, and I look over, and about once a year, it's something of mine. And actually, I had a wonderful experience. One of the one good experience I've ever had as a writer that I fully enjoyed, is when Paris the Moon came out. Did I ever tell you this story? We were on our way downtown to the Green Market, and a young woman, looked very much like you actually, was across the way from us. I was with Olivia, my daughter, who was 2 years old then, an adorable 2-year-old. And she was sort of like Hannah Arendt in a teddy bear costume at that point. And now you just get Hannah Arendt, but in those years she had chubby cheeks and, you know, and the girl I could see was reading the book, and I could just see from the way she held it down that it was the chapter about Olivia being born in Paris, called Like a King. And then she was doing that thing you always do when you have a cute kid on the subway. She was sort of flirting, you know, waving, but then she'd go back to reading it. And then and I thought, my God, the triangle that just got closed here of human experience amongst us sitting here was so thrilling. And there was a part of me that wanted to say, you know, you're reading about this child. And of course I didn't, because that would have broken it. But that satisfaction is very deep. How have I gotten better as a writer? I don't know that I have particularly, though when I read my early stuff in the New Yorker, I'm astounded that anyone would publish it. And they wouldn't. And Whitney Balliet, the great jazz writer, who I think is the single most perfect prose stylist I've ever known, said he doesn't understand why they published the first 20 years of his writing. The last 20 years he thought was good, but the first 20 he thought were not. And the one thing I think is just, you will forgive me if I drop a name here, but I once had a conversation with the great Philip Roth, and Philip Roth said, you know, the only thing is, he said, it never gets easier, but I know it will get done. He meant his novels or something. It never gets easier, but now I know it will get done. And that is about where it gets to, right? It's just as hard and just as discouraging, but I do know at some level it will get done.
Because you've been anxious before.
Because you've been anxious before and it always got done. And you don't remember how it got done.
See, unfortunately for me, in many ways, I think I've become a better editor, which is to say, I know why it's shit now. And in the beginning, I just merrily wrote things down and were so happy that they were maybe spelled right, and then I just sent them off. But
I think it's just sort of, the other thing is that as you know sort of where your voice is located at past a certain point.
You can get places faster.
Yeah, you get places faster. You know where your voice is located. You sort of hear when you're yourself on the page. I have a couple of different voices I use. There's a sort of the tedious sort of untenured professor of history that I use when I'm writing the historical pieces, and then there's the dad voice that I use when I'm narrating stories about the kids, and there's the kind of bleeding voice I use when I'm telling stories about my marriage and so on. But you just get to that voice faster. And you get to the voice faster, and you know inside yourself where when you start out and for the first 10 or 15 years, you think, this will never be finished. I cannot do this. I simply cannot do this. You say, it will get done. I don't know how, and I don't know that it'll be, but it will get done. That's as far as I can say.
Should I be asking more questions, or
there's someone else?
Okay.
Someone else here.
Actually, I have one more.
Please.
I was just curious. Mary Karr referred in her memoir about, basically going back and checking with all the people in her life. And did you and your wife have any, I don't remember it that way, moments?
Curiously, we remembered it we remembered almost everything exactly the same. The same things. In fact, I checked it with her. I said, do you remember? And the only things that were different were that when she first met me, I was very well dressed, and I had a red velvet jacket with a kind of multicolored bow tie that I wore on special occasions. And when I wrote it, I said, for some reason, she had an irrational prejudice against this outfit. And she said, no, you cannot say that. She noticed that this was a ridiculous outfit for. So we differed on that. It's very funny you mentioned Mary Karr, because we had the fun of meeting Mary Karr for the first time, not earlier this summer. And she is a pistol and a half. and wonderful writer. So we got turned on to her writing by what a winning woman she is. But I got to thinking, actually, that Mary and I sort of occupy, I mean, stature aside, the sort of two poles of where the essay, she writes memoir and I write memoir. But her memoirs are really forms of fiction. I don't mean that she makes them up. I just mean that they read like novels, really. And my memoirs are really much closer to essays. They read like essays. And that's sort of the two kind of geographic poles where the memoir can go. It can go into the essay, it can go into what's essentially novelistic writing. And Mary takes it into novelistic writing with enormous effectiveness. And she's had such a weird life, you know. If I sat down to try and write, you know, the weird stuff that happened to me as a kid, it would be like, you know, and then they said, you can't watch Captain Kangaroo today, right? And with Mary's, and then my father took me to the back room where they had the bourbon in a still, and they were making it out of live rabbits while my father beat my mother over the head with an axe. And I sat there and wondered.
Yeah. We went to the library and we thought it was going to be closed.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And I think that's sort of one little piece of writing, and it comes up in the book. I had the chance to talk to Joseph Mitchell, the great writer, when I started at the New Yorker. He still had an office there, and you could hear him working. And someone introduced us, and we used to go to lunch. And we used to go. It wasn't like we were buddies, but I took him to lunch 3 or 4 times at the Oyster Bar in Grand Central. And he said the single best thing I'd ever heard about New Yorker style. He said that all of those writers of his generation each had a wild exactitude of their own. And I love that phrase, a wild exactitude. If I ever write a book about writing, I'll call it a wild exactthat.
Thomas Pynchon wrote that book.
Oh, yeah, did he? And he didn't send me a letter. Again,
Leibowitz.
And the other thing is that Mitchell said once, I finally worked up the courage to ask him. I didn't even think I asked him directly, but he knew I wanted to know why he had stopped writing. He's an incredibly great writer who, for the last 30 years of his life, didn't publish a word. And he said, my subject didn't run out, it ran away. And he meant by that the New York that his style was perfectly suited to describing no longer existed. And I think if there's one thing we tend to underestimate in writing, because all some of us think about is the shape of sentences and paragraphs and so on, is that you're holding a mirror up to a certain piece of the world. I was reading Proust on holiday, and one of the things you realize about Proust is great writer, fantastic sentence shaper, fascinating mind. But he's writing about one of the most interesting periods in human history, the Belle Epoque in Paris. He starts off in a very good place, right? That's an interesting time to be writing about, a rich and glamorous time to be writing about.
I took that comment to mean more about aging than writing, and I think of your dear friend and my friend, though I didn't know him as well, and you write about him so well in the book, Richard Avedon, who aged in a completely different way. What he was writing, he changed when the world changed.
Dick Avedon is sort of the hero of the book in a certain way, because he represented everything I aspired to in New York and loved most, and we were privileged to know him.
But he was always reinventing himself.
No subject ever ran away from Dick. No. Dick was outracing every subject that there was. And he did it until the day he dropped dead while taking a photograph at the age of 81.
And doing something different was a principle. I mean, certainly
making your work grow.
Repeating,
you would have it, and it was not aggravating, but it was daunting if you were a friend of his. I know you got those phone calls too. Adam, I think there's real growth in this new piece, right? But it's time you had to do something totally different.
Yeah.
What if you stopped doing that and you wrote something that was this isn't right, but a dramatic dialogue for two people where they spoke only in Polish. So you'd say, well, I just don't know that I have the capacity to do that. But he would constantly push you to do something you had never done before. And he always did something he hadn't done before. And he never allowed his subjects to run away from him, because he was running faster than they were. And that was one of the things that made him an inspiring presence in both of our lives.
We have time for one last question.
Lady here.
Mine isn't really a question, but we're visiting from New Zealand, and just last week I was looking on my bookshelf in Auckland, looking at Paris to the Moon and thinking, oh, I love that book. And then getting to come here and finding out today that you were speaking is just a real joy. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much for saying that. We have a connection to New Zealand because one of my son's closest friends is his mother's family all come from New Zealand, and he goes back. Where are they from? Everyone knows. Yeah, everyone is. Jennifer Lake. So the Lakes, I think they're in Christchurch, but I honestly don't know. But in any case, he communicated to Luca, Patrick, his friend, communicated to Luca the love for the All Blacks. So the New Zealand national rugby team. And so Luke has an interesting range. He roots for the Montreal Canadiens because that's my hockey team. He roots for the Chelsea in London because we have friends there, and he roots for the All Blacks in rugby. So when the All Blacks were in the, what was it? Was it the World Cup last year? Yeah, we were down there, ready to do the haka, on 14th Street. That's one of the positive sides of globalization, is that you get to do. But anyway, welcome. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming all the way, and thank you both, Adam and Patty, so much for your conversation. Let's give it up for them.